Lab B, PowerShell Remoting Review. Now, the previous several nuggets have all talked about PowerShell remoting from various angles. We've talked about how to use it from a basic perspective, how to authenticate to machines across domain boundaries or even outside of domains. We've even looked at things like PowerShell Web Access, which utilizes remoting to give you an HTML-based console. Now, this lab is going to ask you to answer some questions about all those things to see how much stuck with you. Take a moment, review the preceding nuggets if you need to, and see if you can get through those questions before you watch this nugget. Now, the idea here is that you'll attempt to complete the lab questions on your own before you watch this nugget. And once you've done so, it's time to watch this nugget and see if you got the right answers. Now, if you get a little stuck on some of those questions, rather than reviewing this nugget to try and take a peek at the answers, I really recommend you go back through and review the preceding nuggets that covered remoting so that you can get kind of a better chance of maybe solving those things for yourself, and that's what's really going to make sure this information sticks in your head where it belongs. Now, question 1 asks what configuration changes are necessary to enable incoming remoting connections on a given computer, and they're all tasks that are performed for you by the enable PS remoting command. In fact, an easy way to answer the question is just to run enable PS remoting. Now, this says it's going to start or restart the WinRM service, and it's going to set the WinRM service to start automatically. Now, on certain server operating systems, like Windows Server 2012 and later, those two things are already there by default. Remoting is enabled by default on those. The command also creates a listener, and that'll accept incoming requests over HTTP, that's port 5985 by default, on any IP address that the machine has. It'll also enable a firewall exception for WS-MAN traffic. Now, the only other thing that this does that isn't really listed here is, in addition to doing all those things, it sets up your basic session configurations. So if you run get PS session configuration, you can see the endpoints that are configured on this computer. Now, this is a Windows 7 computer, and I have it running PowerShell version 2, and so those are the endpoints we get by default. You'll get a different list if you're running PowerShell version 3, and there are differences even between a client operating system and a server operating system. But setting those endpoints up is also an important part of what Enable PS Remoting is doing for you. Question 2 says, suppose you make a remoting connection to a computer named member. So we're going, say, from here to there. Now, you then, on member, want to run a command that is an Active Directory command. Now, member is not a domain controller, but it is in a domain, so it's going to need to talk to a domain controller. What problems are you likely to run into, and what could you do to solve the problem? Well, the problem you're likely to run into is the fact that you are now making a double hop. You've made your first hop to connect from your client computer to member, and when it needs to talk to the domain controller, it's going to do so over a second hop. By default, your credential can't be delegated across that second hop. Now, that means the domain controller query can still happen, but the DC is going to see you as coming in anonymously. It might not like that, and it might very well not offer up any information in return, meaning your query will fail. That might be confusing at first, because if you took remoting out of the picture and just ran the query right on the DC, it might work fine. It might even work fine if you just ran the Active Directory command directly on your client, because again, that would only be a single hop over to the domain controller. Well, so what can you do to solve this problem? Well, one choice is the CRED SSP protocol. And I actually set this up in the nugget where I talked about PowerShell remoting, PowerShell Web Access rather, because that's one of the things that often comes into play when you're using PWA. So there's a command, enable WS-MAN CRED SSP, that you're going to run, and you'll need to run it on both of the computers that are kind of involved in this double hop connectivity. And that means you need to run it on the client computer, specifying the role as client, meaning this is where the credential is originating, and you'll need to specify one or more delegate computers. Now, in the nugget on PowerShell Web Access, I specified star.lab.pri. That means my credential is allowed to be delegated to any computer that's in the lab.pri domain. I then went over to member and ran it with role server. I don't need to specify anything else. That simply enables this computer to receive and redelegate my credential. That means my credential can travel across that first hop to make a connection to member, and then it can still travel across that second hop if necessary to get over to the domain controller. And that's not the only way you could solve the problem. Another option would be to enable Kerberos delegation within your domain. A little bit more complicated of a setup, but this is an approach that the PowerShell team and Microsoft certainly recommend, this business of using CredSSP. Now, to be clear, CredSSP is an authentication protocol. It's present on Windows Vista and later, so you're not going to be able to use this on XP or Windows Server 2003. It's time to upgrade, folks. Another thing to remember is that this is not just turning on a feature. It is an actual complete authentication protocol. And that means when you use it, you have to specify that you want it to be used. You have to do a couple of extra things, which we'll talk about in just a second, to make it work, and understand that your credentials are being transmitted across the network in a delegable form. Not sure if that's a word, but I'm going to use it. In a form that allows them to be delegated again. Question 3 says, PowerShell Web Access will only work across what web protocol? Now here I've attempted to get to the machine. I'm going to do it with HTTP. And you'll see a little error right here. Username, password, everything else is grayed out. They're not available. I can't click on anything. And what it said there, if I reload the page, is that the website uses Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, which requires an HTTPS address. Now, the only way I can make this work is if I change it to HTTPS. Of course, because my PWA installation is still using a test certificate, I'm getting this website security certificate error. I can go ahead and accept that. And once I'm connected via HTTPS, then I can actually try to log in. Now, the reason it does that is because you're providing your username and password. Over HTTP, that information would be transmitted in clear text. And it's extremely likely that you're providing administrator, if not domain administrator credentials. And Microsoft just wanted to kind of mitigate the opportunity for those credentials to be nabbed up off the network. It's not at all uncommon for folks to set up a PWA gateway that's perhaps internet facing, maybe living in a DMZ, maybe you have to come in through a VPN or something else. It's certainly an option. And in that case, they really wanted to make sure this thing only worked over an encrypted channel. And so that's what the requirement for HTTPS is all about. Question 4 in your lab asks, is it possible to make a custom session configuration that only permits incoming users to execute a single command? And it certainly is. Let's take a look here. New PS session. Oh, that's right. This is a lot harder to actually set up in PowerShell version 2. So the command we want really lives in PowerShell version 3. New PS session, there we go, configuration file. Now there's some overlap between this and the register PS session configuration command. Both allow you to do some of the same things. This is the one though that really enables what we're after, which is, let's see if we can point to all the right things, the ability to specify specific modules to import. Let's change that to a little brighter of a color. So I can have modules pre-imported as part of this. So once someone connects, those modules are just there. However, instead of making visible every single command or whatever that's in that module, I can restrict the aliases, commandlets, functions, and providers that are available. So despite whatever the module might make available, I can control the visibility at a more granular level. So I could certainly set this up so that someone can only execute a single command once they're attached to this thing. Now the lab's question 5 asks, what are 2 techniques that you can use to enable remoting to a computer that's in an untrusted domain or that isn't in a domain at all? What authentication concept do these 2 techniques deal with? We'll take the second part of that first. The authentication concept is called mutual authentication. It means you're not only providing a credential to the remote computer, but you are authenticating its identity so that you know it's the computer you intended to hook up to. Now, one option for managing that connection, let's see if we can get into the client configuration here, is to set up that trusted hosts list. Now, understand that trusted hosts turns off mutual authentication. It means you're going to be firing your credentials across the network to a computer, and PowerShell itself is not going to do anything to validate that computer's identity. You are handing your keys off to someone in a mask. The only time you would normally do that, I think, is if you're in an environment where you have complete and utter control over the infrastructure. You would never set trusted hosts to just star. You certainly might use a wildcard as part of a larger trusted host entry, like maybe an IP address range that you know is internal to your network only and can't be spoofed or anything else. And the other option, which is more complicated and is what I showed you how to set up in the nugget on this, is to install an SSL certificate on the remote computer. Now that way you can remote to it, pass off your credential. You have to make sure when you're running either invoke command or enter PS session that you're specifying the -use SSL parameter, and that forces it to use HTTPS, and that also forces it to mutually authenticate the remote computer using its certificate rather than a domain account as its identification. Now, its certificate has to be issued from a certification authority that your computer trusts and recognizes, and once you've done that, you know that you're connecting to the right computer, and even better, because you might be transmitting your credentials in clear text using the basic authentication protocol, you know that your credentials are safe anyway because the SSL connection is taking care of encrypting them for you. So, two techniques, trusted hosts or SSL, and those are both leading to the concept of mutual authentication, either by turning it off in the case of trusted hosts or providing an alternative to domain credentials for mutual authentication, namely that SSL certificate. Now suppose you do need to do the double hop thing in your environment and you've gone through the trouble of enabling the WSMan CredSSP protocol. How do you actually use it? Well, if you're looking at a command like enter PS session or invoke command, there's a couple of parameters that are listed as optional, but they become mandatory if you want to use CredSSP. And the first of those is right here, authentication. You'd need to specify authentication CredSSP. That actually engages the protocol. So enabling it is one thing, but you have to actually use it. Once you decide to use that, you also have to specify your credentials. And you would specify that typically in the domain /username, oops, that's a /, domain /username. You'll be prompted for the password. You could also pre-create that using the new credential command if you wanted to, save it to a variable. But in any event, authentication and credential become mandatory once you've enabled CredSSP and want to start using it. So hopefully you took some time to attempt those lab questions on your own and then used this nugget to review the answers, and hopefully you got all of the right answers. If you didn't, don't forget, those preceding nuggets are always there for your review. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.